Good afternoon and welcome to you all to this new webinar hosted and created by the Research Foundation Flanders, better known of course as FWO. At the beginning of this webinar, I would like to address a special welcome to all the new panel members who are joining us here for the first time this afternoon. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation of becoming a panel member of an FWO expert panel. We really appreciate your commitment to the evaluation process and procedures at FWO and for Flanders in general. So a warm welcome and thank you for attending this webinar. This is at the same time the main target group of this webinar, the new and the current expert panel members who are member of an expert panel for the evaluation of the fellowship's fundamental research. What we will learn this afternoon, and we will do this afternoon during this session, is to guide you through the evaluation and the selection process of the fundamental fellowships application on a pre and a postdoctoral level. We will focus also on your specific tasks as a panel member, and we will give you more tips and tricks on the evaluation criteria, scoring, reviews, feedback, and so on. In short, every step of the evaluation process. We will take into account as much as possible issues brought up in recent surveys by panel members. And of course, I would like to remind you this is an interactive webinar, so you can make use of the question button on the right-hand side of your screen. You can put your questions in the tool. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during the webinar, but be assured that if not possible to provide you with an answer during the webinar, we will come back to you by email the following days and weeks. Of course, more details about this presentation, about the specific processes and procedures can be found on our web pages, the program web pages on the FWO website, fwo.be. And of course, you will also find there a link through the broadcast of this webinar and also of the PowerPoint that we will make use of this afternoon. Unfortunately, we still need to include this slide in the presentation. This slide was already present last year, but of course, COVID-19 also in 2021 has a huge impact on the life of our researchers and our applicants, also on the research and the career aspects of the fellowship candidates for FWO. So we invited each of them to indicate throughout their application file possible influence on the quality of their fellowship application. We don't have a dedicated field where they can put in this information, but in the field of career breaks, personal statement, mobility, project description, in short, in every place in the proposal or in the application file where they think it's suitable, they can come back to a possible impact on COVID-19. Of course, we would like to ask you as a panel member, as an evaluator at FWO, to take this information into account in your assessment. I think we all know and all realize that COVID-19 can have a severe impact on a possible lab environment, but also on other aspects, of course, of your research. So it can have also an influence on the application file of the candidates. COVID-19 also has an impact on the panel meetings itself. We have already made the decision that until June 2022, all our panel meetings will be in an online format, even if for the following weeks or months, the situation may be, and we hope for that, of course, may be better also in Belgium. Even then, we have made the decision until June, at least until June, it will be in an online format. After summer, when we take part in the PhD interviews, we still need to make a decision on that aspect. It is possible that in September, we would like to invite you to come to Brussels to attend the panel meetings. But be assured, at least until June, it will be in an online format. Before we really kick off with the content of this webinar, I would like to give you really short a context and some key numbers about FWO as a research council. FWO was founded in 1928, at that time one of the first research councils in Europe, and actually since then our main mission has not changed that much. That means that still today we are the main funding agency in Belgium when it comes to the funding of fundamental and strategic research. We offer a different range of funding programs, funding schemes in order to come to our mission. We have different funding programs aiming on individual researchers. That's also the reason why we are gathered here this afternoon. Of course, to focus on the pre- and the postdoctoral fellowships programs that we are offering. We also offer a wide range of mobility and international mobility schemes. Besides that, we have in our funding portfolio some programs focusing on research teams with projects, with strategic oriented project, our brain gain program, Odysseus, and so on. Also, the funding of research infrastructure is one of the main goals and the main missions of FWO, and we offer also in collaboration with industry and private foundations some scientific prizes and awards. The way we do things at FWO for almost all our programs is based on a bottom-up principle. That means, of course, that researchers can come to us with new innovative ideas, and we, and in this case, the we stand for you as experts, we will evaluate the applications and value them on the excellence, the scientific excellence. Bottom-up also means that we don't point down specific teams, specific topics. In actually every topic can submit an application through FWO channels. Scientific excellence is key, and of course also inter-university competition is a key element in our procedures. University and of course also research institutions like, for example, IMEC or VIB can participate in the competition. And FWO stands also for transparent and equal opportunities, but I think that speaks for itself. To conclude this first introductory part of this webinar, I've also included this slide with a short infographic giving some key numbers about FWO. You can see that the annual budget of FWO is this year 440 million euro. That's quite substantial, of course. And with that budget, we fund 75% of that budget is going to fundamental research, 16% to strategic basic oriented research. We still have a very focused specific clinical research program for 4%, and research infrastructure I already mentioned for 6%. In total, FWO funds for the moment directly and indirectly to research projects more than 4,000 researchers, and that makes us one of the largest players in Belgium, of course. To offer equal opportunities to male and female researchers is very important. You can see on a pre-doctoral level, for the moment, we have exactly a 50-50 split up between female and male researchers. On a postdoctoral level, for the moment, it's 40-60%. So that's still a point of attention, of course, in our processes. Flanders is a small region, so international mobility and internationalization is a very important aspect. You can see that on the right-hand side of the slide, that for the moment, 21% of our pre-doctoral fellows are coming from abroad. On a postdoctoral level, that's even 40%. So our funding schemes are very open, are very international, and of course, for every nationality can participate in the competition and in this procedure. To conclude, we also have I've summarized the success rate of our funding scheme, so the number of, or the percentage of applications that in the end receive funding. You can see there on a pre-doctoral level, it's almost 1 out of 3 that receive funding based on the numbers of last year. On a postdoctoral level, last year it was 22% the success rate for postdoctoral junior and senior. I can already inform you that for the call 2022, it will be a bit higher, of approximately 25% for the postdoctoral junior and 27-28% for the postdoctoral senior. So that's a good evolution on that aspect. And by that, I would like to conclude this part of the presentation to set the scene, to give the context. And I'm glad to give the floor to my colleague Alexandra, who will guide you to the different fellowship programs offered by FWO.
Indeed, Hans, thank you. So at FWO, we have two main programs for the fellowships. First, we have the PhD fellowships with a term of 4 years, 2 years plus a 2-year extension. And this program is meant for young researchers, less than 3 years after obtaining their master degree. We have two types of PhD fellowships, and these are organized in parallel calls. First of all, we have the PhD fellowships fundamental research, and these are evaluated in the panels for which you are currently a member. Then we also have the PhD fellowships strategic basic research, or SB, and these are evaluated by other panels and experts. Then next, we have the postdoctoral fellowships with a term of 3 years. We have two types of postdoctoral fellowships. We have the junior postdoctoral fellowships for researchers who have obtained their PhD maximum 3 years ago on the starting date of the fellowship. This is October 1st. And then we have the senior postdoctoral fellowships. And this is for researchers who have obtained their PhD between 3 and 6 years ago on this same date, and who have at least 2 years of postdoctoral experience. Next slide, please. Okay, let's have a look at our panel's fundamental research. So in FWO, we have two types of panels for fundamental research. First, we have the fellowship panels who are responsible for evaluating the PhD and the postdoc calls. And in parallel, we also have the project panels. This means that we have 2 times 31 panels. So 31, this means 30 panels in 5 different scientific domains, and an interdisciplinary panel, which can handle cross-domain applications. Each panel consists of 12 panel members, including a scientific chair. The panel members are composed of more than half of the members with a non-Flemish affiliation. So this means that they are true international panels. A panel is guided by 2 chairs. First of all, the scientific chair is a panel member, him or herself, with a non-Flemish affiliation, always an international member. And then we also have the administrative chair, who is always an FWO staff member. Applicants themselves have the responsibility to choose the panel that best fits their application. So they have to make sure that their application fits the panel scopes, which are available on our website, also available to you. For the interdisciplinary panel, there's an acceptance criteria decision tree, which applicants can follow to see whether their application indeed fits this specific panel. An application can be considered out of scope by a panel, but this is a very rare situation. A full panel consensus is needed for this, and it is a very strong decision because it means that the application is fully rejected and no longer eligible for funding. So this decision is never taken lightly.
Thank you, Alexandra. So, sorry to interrupt, but we already received the first question from the audience, and it's very specific about the duration of the fellowships, on the pre-doctoral fellowships. The question is, what does the 2 + 2 years mean exactly for the PhD projects? Is there an assessment after the 2 years of PhD?
So in general, almost all of our PhD fellowships are 4 years long, but there has to be indeed a moment where a report has to be handed in by the applicant, and the supervisor at that point has to confirm that everything is on track. But the large majority of our PhDs indeed have a 4-year PhD, which they fulfill. There is no separate evaluation by the panel itself or so. This is more an administrative step for going to the full 4 years. Okay, then next, one point that we already want to let you know about is that currently at the FWO, we are working on a panel structure reform. So we plan to implement a change to the panel structure in 2022 in preparation of the 2023 calls. And this panel structure reform may impact the scientific scope of your panel. And we will contact you about this throughout the year 2022. Okay, in the next part of this presentation, we will talk about the evaluation and selection process, where I will first present an overview of the process, and then my colleagues will go through the evaluation criteria, the selection process, the roles in the panel, and the timeline for 2021. So first of all, here you see an overview of our process for the postdoctoral evaluation. This is a single submission process, so the applicants submit one file at one certain moment. And on the evaluator side, it's a two-phase evaluation and selection process. The first phase consists of a remote assessment by 2 external reviewers and 2 panel members, followed by a synthesis by the panel rapporteur. Then there is a panel meeting. This is the pre-selection meeting, an online meeting. Also in non-COVID circumstances, this is an online meeting in which a consensus scoring and ranking is decided upon. Some proposals are rejected in that phase and others are retained for phase 2, the interview phase. And in that phase, there is again a panel meeting, which can be online in the COVID circumstances or in Brussels if if the pandemic allows it. And after an interview, the consensus scoring and ranking is decided upon. Again, some proposals are rejected in that phase and some candidates are selected. After that, feedback is then sent to all candidates, and this is written by the rapporteur. Then we have the PhD fellowships. This program follows a very similar layout for the process. The main change that we have here is that the remote assessment is done by 3 panel members who are all internal reviewers. So there is no external review for the PhD fellowship. The feedback is in this case also written by one of the internal reviewers and not by a specific rapporteur. But for the rest, the process is in fact the same as for the postdocs, and we will go into more detail about all these different steps in the next slides by one of my colleagues, Dirk, who will now take over for the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. For the assessment, as an expert and panel member, you of course need to know something more on the criteria on how to evaluate on. And from this year on, FWO pays specific attention to the candidate criterion, mainly that we're paying attention to various researcher profiles and various research results. In this way, FWO is following an international trend, moving away from the typical one-sided focus on the classical output criteria like journal publications and the following bibliometrics. Moving in a way towards a broader view on scientific accomplishment. And we will elaborate that in the coming slides. And this is an opportunity to the candidates to, in their application form, demonstrate the versatility in building up their own research career, describing that career by a range of scientifically relevant activities, skills, experiences, and achievements. We adapted the application form for the candidate as well as we did adapt the evaluation criteria as they are described in the so-called scoring grid. What was already in place is specific attention on, no, I'm just still on slide 13, on the senior postdocs, on the scientific independence to be used as an asset in the assessment. So the candidate should be able to show evidence of publications or scientific achievements without their actual PhD promoter. And also we're looking towards, is there already interinstitutional mobility, or within the institution changing from a working research group environment since obtaining their PhD. Or of course the candidate can also show other evidence. And we repeat that you should take into account in the evaluation the scientific seniority of the candidates in terms of raising or lowering the bar for instance, postdocs in a very junior status, just obtained a PhD. Within the junior postdocs, you also have candidates with almost 3 years of postdoc experience. You should take that into account, and certainly for the PhD candidates, where there are a number of last year master students candidating versus candidates already 1 or 2 year PhD experience. And this is then translated into the actual evaluation criteria. So there's also a main criterion for project that we follow the classic evaluation criteria on originality, risks and challenges, feasibility, research methodology, and so on. You'll be able to score on a scale of 0 till 7, from unacceptable and weak to excellent and outstanding, using for the criterion candidate 2 sub-criteria as an internal evaluator: the scientific contribution so far by the candidate and the relevant competences and motivation. Scientific contribution, there we're looking, as we said, on a range, a variety of scientifically relevant activities as well as actual achievements. It's the quality and the impact rather than the quantity of publications that we're looking for, but also other meaningful scientific output, let's say data, software, prototypes, keynote lectures on a conference, organization of an event, and so on. Also, we're looking for evidence on impact of the research, impact beyond the actual publications, but societal or economical impact, for instance. Another thing is emerging reputation and upward trajectory that the candidate can show evidence of. And as said, the developing of the scientific independence is also important for the senior candidates. Candidates should also tell us about their scientific background and show that their competences fit the proposed research project. They should talk about their motivation and their research vision also on their own career development. Career development as a variety of activities, skills, and experience, as said. Can be education activities, participation to network, loose collaborations with other researchers, actual mobility, research stays in other organizations, R&D services to the industry, for instance, and also for the senior candidates, supervision and mentoring of master and doctoral students, and institutional responsibilities can be taken into account for the assessment. For the weighting of both criteria into a total score, there's also a small change compared to previous years. Now there's a 50-50 distribution of candidate and project criterion. And this is also translated in the application form, and that's of course what you will read before the assessment. We will ask also the candidate, we have asked the candidates to sum up to 5 main achievements, can be publications, can be other achievements, apart to the classical list of publications. We also ask for other meaningful scientific output and societal economical impact of their previous research or the current research and potential then, of course. There's also a statement on their motivation to show what are the competences as well, what are the research interests and their vision on their career, and how does their scientific background and their competences fit the actual research topic and project. They should be able to show evidence of expertise and skills built up, but also to be further acquired to you as an evaluator. And then, as said, they have provides the opportunity to show activity, skills, and experience in building up their own research career. Mobility, of course, even in COVID times, remains very important. Research stays in other organizations, also mobility within Belgium, intersectoral mobility, do research, perform research, for instance, in a company, and so on. In the second evaluation round, the interviews, we try to make up the global picture of the candidate, and the shift, the focus shift more or less to the assessment now of the competence of the candidate. Is that the candidate that is fit to obtain a postdoc fellowship by the FWA? Of course, implicitly we take into account the findings from the pre-selection, and we are assessing also the content, not so much the performance, but the content of their pitch and their interview, focusing on their potential, between brackets, their competence as a postdoc researcher, their expertise and their knowledge in their own research field. How do they approach and position their project into the research landscape? We should assess their reasoning skills and the critical scientific mindset, and above all, also a clear vision, a realistic vision on their professional future and motivation. Also in this round, there is a 50-50 distribution of candidate score and project score. Similar accounts for the PhD fellowships, but of course on a different level. For these candidates, we still look at their achievements in terms of their study results during their academic education. They should be able to position themselves in their own study group, their study year, but also are able to come up with other equivalent evidence of having distinguished themselves during their studies, having to stand out during their studies. Apart from that, apart from these maybe some numbers and acquisitions of competences, they should also be able to tell us about their research interest and motivation to start a PhD. Again, with past and planned, a range of possible activities, skills, and experience that they are able to describe, and a scientific background and competence that makes them ready, at least to start that challenge, the 4-year PhD project. Again, for the interviews, we try to make up the whole picture, the global picture of the candidate and their qualities and their competences, knowledge, the insight in their own project, and the critical skills, reasoning skills you need to work towards a PhD. Motivation, of course, also being important. That is also translated in the application form. It's good to know that we ask certainly the candidates that obtained their master in Flemish University can find that information. The percentile, so the global percentage positioned, percentage of the master study positioned in their study group. Are they in the top 5%, in the top 30%, the top 50%? That's one global number that can be used to assess the quality of their study result acquisitions. For the non-Flemish diploma, often these data are not available, and then we refer, also for the Flemish candidates, we refer to a large narrative text field that they can use to try to convince you as a panel member that they have a good track record as a student and that they are promising based on their study results. Maybe a little bit more difficult for those who are in their last master years. They can show us their first master year study results. They can talk about their master thesis, dedicated courses, marks, and grades that they have obtained. Yes, Hans, there is a question.
There is indeed a question, Dirk. For PhDs, do we look also at the match between the supervisor and the student in question?
It can play a role, but it's not, let's say, a large priority. Of course, in many cases, you may know the promoter and what he stands for. You may know the research group. There is a text field foreseen where the candidate can explain how they and their proposed research may fit into the activities of the research group, but not specifically the promoter as a person, no. Okay, as for the postdoc candidates, we ask the PhD candidates for a motivation statement, their personal motivation, their research interest, and how limited it may be, their real scientific background that enables them to start with a PhD research. And of course, they learn a lot performing their master thesis or even their academic bachelor thesis, or they have already started as a PhD researchers and they learn something. Well, it's up to them to describe that and to convince you as an evaluator that this is sufficient to start the PhD. Other skills like transferable skills like experimental skills, presentation or writing skills, commitment or perseverance, whatever case they have to make evidence of that may be welcome. Also, the first step as a potential researcher and what they plan to do a second step, so to speak, may be important for you to make up a picture and assess the qualities and the potential qualities of the candidates. Of course, they may have publications, but it's not obligatory, and they may have other output, data, software prototypes, or awards for their thesis, and so on. Mobility, which will be more planned mobility, but what are they planning as research stays in other organizations in Belgium or abroad? And now,
yeah, sorry, Dirk. Maybe just a few questions that we received on this point. I can say, like often is the case about the percentiles. We know that we receive quite a lot of questions about it aspect by panel members, but also by applicants. So now we have a question, a very specific one, maybe. How are percentiles of students compared in case some are obtained in masters where an entrance exam limits the inflow of lower level students, thereby lowering the percentile of all other students, such as in medicine or so on. But I think we can answer this question more in general, as of course it's always difficult to compare these kinds of percentiles.
Yeah, we realize that this is a single number and it's very dangerous to put a whole assessment on it, and that's why we foresee a large narrative text field where everyone can position the percentile and make it more relative and explain why it is low or why in other cases it's very high maybe. Also, you can have the bad luck that as a student you are in a very strong group. Well, if you have evidence to tell that and to explain that, a candidate should do so. And as an evaluator, you should take that into account. And that's also foreseen in the scoring grid as well, to put the percentile in the right context.
Thank you. Then we have some questions, and I will take them as a whole, connecting with the profile of our candidate. So there are some questions about how is FWO accounting for any inequalities candidates may have experienced, other than the gender gap, but what we call widening participation. Another viewer also asked, what do you at FWO do to encourage and support applications from a diverse range of junior researchers? There can be a built-in bias in terms of students from more privileged background or in more privileged research environments. And also third question from this aspect is, are there any specific rules or criteria about female candidates beside the ones already mentioned in the presentation?
Well, FWO is following a policy that is making the fellowships available for all types of persons, of course, and this diversity is the rule. Of course, the problem may be on where the candidates are streaming in. And that's also an issue, of course, at universities, because candidates need to find a promoter before they can candidate. And so that's the first step they need to do. And so in a way, it's also shared responsibility with the host institutes, I guess.
Yeah, on that aspect, we can also add that FWO is organizing in every host institution in Flanders specific info sessions where we take into account all these elements and also promote the fellowships that we offer. We also are collaborating with other European research councils where we promote this kind of fellowships also to attract other kind or other applicants not already present in Flanders. So we are really aiming on a broad audience and a broad participation in these funding schemes. The number we show in the introductory slides also show that to attract researchers from abroad, that's quite successful within FWO. To attract researchers with a different cultural background and so on, that's also pointed out by Dirk. There we have, together with the host institutions in Flanders, a close collaboration in order to stimulate them to submit applications and also help them where possible by preparing their application files in question.
Okay, then Anne is now going to tell you more about the scoring grid.
Yes, thank you, Dirk. So we have one scoring grid that we send to all of you and that we ask you to use across all panels, across all different disciplines. And that is because we, of course, aim for uniform evaluation across our panels of our 31 panels at FWO. We want to really encourage you to get acquainted with the whole range of scores and their descriptors in these scoring grids that are sent to you. We want to encourage you to really use the whole range of the scoring grid. Frequently we see that panel members tend to use the upper green range of the scoring grid more frequently than the lower range of the scoring grid. And of course, if we have excellent candidates, this is what you should do. But we do want to encourage you to take the whole range into account. The criteria are quite clear. We think you should check them when you try to determine your score, and of course fine-tune throughout the process, keeping in mind that the benchmark is not the applications in your panel in that call, but then in the international standard, of course, for the postdocs or the PhD, depending on whom you're evaluating. And keeping in mind that in our score grid, a score of 4 means that the application is considered acceptable for funding. If the panel had unlimited funding available, anybody who receives a total score of 4 and 2 subscores of 4 would receive the funding. So that's where you're kind of aiming at. Would you, in circumstances of unlimited budget, fund this particular application? The top score of 7 is really meant for absolute top applications, top 5% of the international standard. So this is really exceptional and is a score that should not be handed out without due consideration. Then something more about how the fellowships are distributed across the panels. So from the whole pot of fellowships that we have available at FWO, 90% goes directly to the panels and is distributed there proportionally to the number of applications that a panel receives. So to put it shortly, if you are in a panel that receives a lot of applications, your panel will also have a lot of fellowships to hand out. If you're in a smaller panel that receives fewer applications, you will of course have fewer fellowships to hand out. The number of fellowships you can hand out as a panel is called the panel quota. So this is how 90% of our fellowships are distributed. 10% of the fellowships we keep, and these are assigned to the best remaining candidates, the candidates that just didn't make it in their panel, but we compare them across all panels. These are the wild cards. Panels can give out wild cards to still excellent candidates they can't fund, and all of these wild cards are compared across our panels, and the top wild cards still receive a fellowship from us. So how does this work? In the first phase of the evaluation cycle, the pre-selection, the panel ranks all of the candidates on the basis of the scores, and you can then determine that 2 times the quota, so 2 times the number of fellowship your panel has available, it can be invited to interview. So say your panel has 5 fellowships available to hand out, this means that you can invite 10 candidates. This also means for our candidates that if they're invited to interview, they have 50% chance or more of receiving the funding or more, because of course candidates can still drop out. In the second phase, during the interviews, you can of course hand out your quota of fellowships available to your panel. These are given to the best ranked candidates in the panel who must have a score of 4 or more for both the criteria candidate and the criteria project. The best remaining candidates are then ranked across all panels, and they are assigned the remaining 10% of the fellowships. And this list also serves as a reserve list for in case, for example, a candidate who has received the fellowship still withdraws, then we pick somebody up from this reserve list. The universities, for example, also use our reserve list to offer bridging fellowships or specific fellowships funded by the university or other institutions. So being on this reserve list, being a wild card, may be beneficial to the candidate, even if they don't receive funding from us. Then we want to briefly talk about the roles in the panel and the tasks of each role in the panel. So most of you are panel members. In each panel, there are in principle 11 panel members, and then there's a scientific chair. What are the core tasks of our panel members? First and foremost, of course, we ask you to evaluate the applications that your panel receives. You may do this as either an internal evaluator, and then you are asked to write a basic review report using the template that we offer and using the score grid that I've just discussed. In the postdoc call, we also appoint panel members as rapporteurs. These are people who can write a kind of meta review, if you will, a synthesis of the reviews written by the other panel members, the internal reviewers, and by the external reviewers that have been invited to also submit a review of this application. So the rapporteur in the panel is the panel member who writes a synthesis about the 4 other review reports on the application. Panel members are also asked then to prepare feedback to candidates, to our applicants, and this is very important to the FWO, that we can offer really good feedback reports to our applicants. If you are a rapporteur for the postdoc, you will be asked to write a feedback report for the applicant or one of the internal evaluators in the PhD call. You will know at the beginning of the call for which applications you will be asked to submit feedback reports at the end of the call. So please pay attention throughout the review process, and keep in mind that you will be asked to report back to the candidates about the assessment of their application. Finally, of course, panel members are expected to participate in the panel meetings, and as was already indicated earlier, there's a pre-selection meeting. This is always in an online setting, and then there's a selection interview meeting. This can be online in COVID times, or we hope in the near future again in Brussels, an in-person meeting at the FWO offices in Brussels. And then finally, the panel is also responsible for reviewing the activity reports of ongoing or recently finished fellowships, so fellowships handed out by the panel in the past. This is something that the chairs really take the lead in, but that you may be asked to provide some input as a panel member throughout this process as well. If you're in a scientific chair of the panel, this means that you are a panel member who is not affiliated to an institution in Flanders. So you're an international fellow member. And what are the tasks of the scientific chair? They provide, of course, scientific guidance throughout the review process in collaboration with the administrative chair. The scientific chair selects and appoints the internal evaluators, and for the postdocs only the rapporteurs for each application. So it's the scientific chair who determines which panel members evaluates which application in detail, writes a review report, and the scientific chair, of course, also prepares the panel meetings in collaboration with the administrative chair. The scientific chair chairs the panel meetings, then advises the administrative chair in monitoring feedback reports. So all of your feedback reports are monitored by the chairs. This is something that the administrative chair does mainly, but the scientific chair also keeps an eye on this. And then finally, the scientific chair prepares the evaluation of the activity reports of the ongoing and finished fellowships, the thing that I just mentioned. Here, the chair really takes the lead.
Yeah. Also on these slides, we have received some questions. I will not tackle them all because there are quite a few. But one of the questions is, are all committee members expected to report on all proposals in the panel, or only those on which they have expertise?
You are expected to submit a written report on the applications that are assigned to you by the scientific chair. And at the very beginning of the process, and this has actually already happened for the postdoc call this year, you will be asked to tell us your confidence level for each application so that the chair knows how confident you are for reviewing something. And this will, of course, be taken into account when you are assigned applications. This being said, we expect our panel members to have a broad range of interest and also to be able to have a general background and to be able to evaluate things that might be outside of your primary area of expertise. So you may be asked in certain circumstances to write a report on things that are not fully within your primary area of expertise, but we expect that this should not pose too much of a problem.
Thank you. And I think it's mentioned further on in the presentation, but also one question, how many reviews receives each applicant?
Each applicant receives, in the PhD call, each applicant receives 3 reviews. So 3 panel members look at each application in detail, but the full panel, of course, discusses the application. But there are 3 written reviews from 3 different panel members writing these independently from one another. For the postdocs, there are 2 panel members who write an internal review report independently from one another. Then there are 2 external experts who are really on-topic experts about the specific topic of the application, who also write independently from one another a review report. These 4 reports are then sent to the rapporteur, who's a 3rd panel member who looks at these reports and writes a kind of synthesis, and later on also the feedback. So in total for the postdocs, there are 5 people looking at this application in detail.
Thank you. Then one question I can maybe answer myself. The funding given to these applicants is the same for each type of fellowship. That's indeed so. So we have a specific grant for the predoctoral fellowships and for the postdoctoral junior and senior, of course, but we take into account the seniority of the applicants. So someone with more experience in science or in research, whether in academia or in industry, will receive a bit higher salary than another one. So we take into account, as is commonly the case in Belgium, the seniority for each of these researchers. But in general, we have indeed a fixed salary for each of the fellowship types.
So finally, a final role in the panel is the administrative chair. This is, as Alexandra indicated earlier, an FWO staff member. Typically, staff members are responsible for several panels in any one call, and they provide mainly procedural guidance. They manage the conflicts of interest that panel members may have. They make sure that there is a correct application of the assessment criteria, the scoring grid, that US panel members really apply these scoring grids, and they ensure the adherence to all FWO regulations. Together with the scientific chair, they prepare the panel meetings. They monitor feedback reports. So all of the feedback reports you write are read by the administrative chair, who really makes sure that their quality is okay. And then in collaboration with the scientific chair, they also manage the activity reports of the ongoing and recently finished fellowships. So this is something that they take care of as well. Then a word on our timeline this should be the timeline for 2022. If everything went well, you should have already received an individual timeline for your panel. So you should know when your specific panel meetings have been scheduled, and some of the submission dates at which your reviews are expected to be submitted. The deadlines are dependent on the meeting date of your panel. But here you see a kind of general overview of the postdoc call and the PhD call for 2022. So now we want to offer you a brief intermezzo by giving you a clip of our colleagues at the Royal Society about unconscious bias.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10p. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10p. The answer is actually 5p. Many of us choose 10p without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now, because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
All right, in this next part of the presentation, we will show you how to perform as a panel member in 10 steps. So first of all, there is a preparation phase in which you access the e-portal and the extranet, submit your conflicts of interest and confidence rates. Well, let's indeed immediately go to step 0. Your gateway to the FWO is the e-portal. So many of the actions that you will have to do as a panel member, where you have to submit information or submit a review, will go through this e-portal. This can be located via our FWO website, fwo.be, or you can directly access the e-portal via fwoweb.fwo.be. And there, the panel member tab will actually be a very essential place where you can, for example, submit your review reports. A very first step in the process, which is already ongoing or already ended for the postdoctoral fellowships, is the submission of the information on potential conflicts of interest for each application. And the confidence rates. So you have received an email with an overview of all applications and an invitation to indicate these potential conflicts of interest for each application. Some may already have been filled in, because on the institutional level, we already check if you're affiliated with a certain institution that corresponds to the one of an application. We also ask you to indicate your confidence rate per application, with a 1 being a very low confidence level and 5 being a very high confidence rate. At this point, we want to highlight that it's very important to mind the code of conduct during the full process. As a panel member, you act as an independent researcher and not as a representative of the host institution. Furthermore, if you would be contacted by an applicant or a supervisor, for example, asking them how the evaluation went, always refer them to the FWO for all information, never give them any information, and please notify the FWO that you have been contacted directly by an applicant. This is not the way that the communication should go. Furthermore, we have our partner organization, ESF, who is responsible for contacting the external reviewers. So these are not panel members, but scientists who are contacted to write one external review report. If you would be contacted by them to act as an external reviewer for FWO, please decline this. The role of panel member and external reviewer cannot be combined. And just inform ESF that you are an FWO panel member. Okay, the next step in the whole procedure is the assignment of the internal evaluation reports. The scientific chair, assisted by the administrative chair, assigns the applications to panel members, taking into account these confidence rates that we've mentioned in the previous slide, but also, as Anne previously indicated, assuming some generalist expertise from each of the panel members. Also, the conflicts of interest are of course taken into account in this step. For the postdocs, as mentioned, there are 2 internal reviewers and 1 rapporteur. For the PhDs, there are 3 internal reviewers, one of which is assigned to compile the feedback to the candidate. You will receive an invitation and clear guidelines to evaluate the applications assigned to you. If you would need to refuse a certain assignment, for example, because there is a conflict of interest that you had not noticed before, please talk timely to your scientific and administrative chair first. So please notify them and discuss the issue. And please do not do this very late in the evaluation process. Please do this as soon as possible so that we can make sure that another panel member can, for example, take over this task in time. Okay, so the next step is the writing of the internal evaluation reports. Here we go over this process for the postdocs. So as mentioned, there are 2 external reviewers and 2 panel members writing such a report. It's very important in this phase and in all phases to respect the submission deadlines so that all procedures can take place as planned. So in this phase, you will need, of course, to read the application, but it's also important to take the score grids into account. Your report will be then one of 4 reports in total in this phase, together with one other internal evaluation report by a panel member and 2 external evaluation reports by the on-topic specialist external reviewers. Then in the next phase, these 4 reports will be synthesized to a synthesis report by the rapporteur. For the PhD evaluations, it's a very similar setting, but in this case, your report will be one of 3 internal evaluation reports. And here there is no synthesis report by a rapporteur, but the average scores for the criteria candidate and project over these 3 different reports are the starting values for the panel meeting and are used to make up a preliminary ranking, which will then be further discussed during the meeting. Now let's have a look at the preparation of the internal review reports. For your report, we ask you to be concise, but to add value. Please do not copy paste any information from the proposal. We mean the grades, the publication numbers, etc. We ask you to give your appreciation of these and not the mere numbers. So indicate whether it's a strong or a weak publication record, for example. Also, properly substantiate your appreciation and the scores, the strengths, the weaknesses, the conclusions that you can make, and suggestions for improvement. It's also important, as mentioned, to properly use the score grids. So for the different criteria for candidate and projects, there will each be 2 text and scoring fields with sub-criteria. For a candidate, this is scientific contribution for the postdocs and study results for the PhDs. And then next we have motivation and competences, both for the postdocs and the PhDs. Then for the projects, there are 2 sub-criteria. This is scientific quality and approach and feasibility. Per sub-criterion text field, you can indicate strengths, weaknesses, and comments and suggestions for improvement. And when it comes to the scoring, there will be a pick list available with scores going from 7 excellent to 0. And as mentioned already previously, when writing this report, it's very important to properly use the score grids. How do you use this to assign scores? For each of the sub-criteria, you should start checking whether the 4 or 5 criteria, good or very good box, is actually met. As mentioned, the 4 threshold means worth funding. So if these items apply, you are at least in a 4 or a 5 as a score. And then you can check whether also all elements of the 6 or 7 excellent outstanding score do apply. And in that case, your evaluation can be in this range. If the criteria for the good, very good, the 4 or 5 box are not met, then of course you can look into the direction of the lower than 3, fair, reasonable, etc. Let's then go further with my colleague Dirk, who will talk to you about how to prepare the synthesis reports.
Yes, thank you. Step 4 is only for the postdoc program, of course. It's the rapporteur who comes in. They are reading the application as well as overlooking the scoring grid, and they have 4 reports to make a synthesis of. Synthesis report is written for the criterion candidate as a main criterion and the criterion project, so summarizing the 2 sub-criteria each time. We realize a rapporteur for an application is a quite delicate responsibility. You need to take into account as well the 2 internal as well as the external reviews from the on-topic specialists. And of course, the synthesis report may include also your own opinion, but of course you do not need to write an entirely new review. For scoring, you should start by an average of the scores, but then you can start putting more weight to one or another score of your colleague experts. Of course, if you do that, you should be able to motivate that in your synthesis report, why you have taken into account some remark more than another remark. Then you assign a score per main criterion, candidate and project with half a point resolution. And this will lead for all the applications to a preliminary ranking, which is a mere suggestion to start the pre-selection meeting. So you as a rapporteur suggest 2 scores together with your report for a certain application. For all applications, this means we're starting the pre-selection meeting with a number of starting values that we will discuss and maybe amend to make up a consensus decision for all applications. And then there is step 5.
Sorry,
first.
sorry, one question first. About this slide, we received one question. So are scores of individual panel members calibrated so that a panel member using only scores, for example, 5 to 7, does not weigh more or heavily than another panel member using low scores?
Calibration, not numerically, but the rubber can take into account whether they think that one or another score is too exaggerated, is too mild, or is too severe. And they can then explain that in their synthesis report, how they have come to the final proposal for a score by the rapporteur. Then there is the preparation for the pre-selection meeting in both programs. First, it is being prepared by the 2 chairs of the panel, and they have a look at the provisional ranking that is based on the scores of the rapporteurs, or in the PhD program, the average scores from the 3 internal reviewers. They will be looking at and discussing how consistent and how diverse individual scores of internal and external evaluators are, and what the different statements in the reports are. And they make it, they point it as discussion items for the whole panel. Also, other issues can be discussed as problems with parallel funding probability or out of scope files and so on. The result of that preparation will be sent to all the panel members as a briefing mail. And this will also include some statistics on your own scoring behavior as a panel member, having written a number of internal evaluation reports. We also tell you more about the online meeting scenario and the procedure to allow for efficient discussions. So you should then prepare the meeting yourself, be ready to substantiate your own internal and or synthesis reports to the whole panel. You may also suggest, of course, discussion items and asking to talk about certain applications that may seem very consistent and not to be told more about, but you can always ask to put that on the agenda. We also kindly invite you to check all applications, also the applications you did not have to review personally, and also the various reports that are all available through your e-portal. The final sentence here is that the discussion during the panel meeting is open on all applications, is open to all panel members. Then at the selection meeting, so in the left upper corner, you see all the material we have available as a discussion material. We have also the scores, the starting ranking that can be discussed and can be amended by the whole panel. So every end score, every decision on who makes it through the pre-selection or not is a consensus decision taken in principle by the whole panel. So mind that your individual scores as an internal reviewer do not longer play a role. We are not fixing and changing individual scores, but the starting scores, so being the scores of the rapporteur or the average internal review scores. They are amended, they are changed, and we can adjust them with a resolution of 1/4 of a point for the criterion candidate as well as for the criterion project. And the final aim, of course, is to denote the cutoff of the pre-selection. So what candidates make it to the interview phase and what candidates do not make it and are ending their evaluation process at this time.
Yeah, we also received a question on this aspects. Dirk, can a Belgian panel member participate in discussions on applications submitted by applicants from their own institution?
Yes, they cannot write an internal review on candidates from their own institution, but they are allowed to be part of the discussion, of course, with a certain prudence, so to speak. But in principle, they are able, as long as the candidate and the application is not related to their own research group or is not too close to their own department. Then after the pre-selection meeting, we ask all panel members to prepare a feedback. For the application, they were designated to as an internal reviewer for the PhD or are the rapporteur for in the postdoc program. So depending on the program, you start there for your feedback on the various synthesis report and the 3 internal evaluation reports. Mind that this has to be edited and should also include the findings of the very pre-selection meeting, and also related to the consensus scores that were assigned by the whole panel. And you will see them in your e-portal, these final and consensus decided scores. So you should submit for the not returned application, you should already submit your feedback 1 week after the pre-selection meeting. For those candidates, those applications that make it to the interview, this is only a provisional feedback, because also the findings from the interview will need to be added to the feedback. Next slide. So please, as it will also be shown in your template already from the internal evaluation reports, we would advise you to use a certain format talking about first strengths and weaknesses, and then some general concluding comments together with possible suggestions for improvement for the criterion candidate or for the criterion project. And that structure should also be used throughout the whole feedback process. It's important that you are able to add some value for the candidate. Your feedback can be concise, but should be meaningful. It should also reflect not your personal opinion, but the whole panel consensus decision. And you should be able to substantiate scores, certainly for the rejected candidates, referring and connecting to the score grid of the pre-selection phase, helping the candidates understand why they did not make it through the pre-selection. You can, and we advise you to include also relevant but anonymous remarks from the other reviewers, also external reviews, because candidates and postdoc candidates as well do not receive the individual review reports. Also, we ask you not to copy or paste facts and data from the candidate's very application. So when they obtain their master, is of course something that the candidates are very well aware of themselves. It should not be in the feedback report.
Yeah, we received one question about this feedback procedure. When writing common reports, can rapporteurs contact directly another panel member or even an external reviewer who participate in the evaluation of the same application in the case there are substantial differences in evaluations between them?
I guess it's possible to contact your fellows panel members, but normally the external reviewers, their job is finished when they have sent in, and normally we do not have the contact details ourselves. So we advise you not to contact them. Then for step 8, I'm going back to Anne.
Are we, Dirk? Okay. I didn't know that,
That's not for
but
me.
that's
Nope.
fine. That's okay. So step 8 is preparing the interviews, and here you will receive a briefing that will explain the meeting scenario and the procedure, so that an efficient discussion during the interview meeting is possible as well. And here it is particularly important that you keep in mind that the scoring grid for the interview is somewhat different for the criterion of the candidate as it is in relation to the scoring grid for the first phase, the pre-selection phase. So when you're preparing the interview meeting, prepare questions that really gauge the candidate's potential competence as a PhD or a postdoc fellow. You can use questions on the project that they submitted to do this, but you really want to get a good sense during the interview of what their competence or their potential to develop this competence is. So that's really what you're focusing on when you do the interviews. So then you do the actual interviews. In step 9, the interview meeting, candidates will begin their presentation with a brief elevator pitch. We tell them to try to add value to the application that they already submitted, that you've already seen. So they have been invited to highlight additional achievements. So for example, if they have achieved their final master degree, they've finished their MA thesis, or they've had a publication, anything that they've done since submitting their application, we invite them to really highlight in their pitch, and you can take this into account. The pitch is followed by an interactive discussion with the panel, a Q&A, and here you should of course prepare questions using the scoring grid for the interview section of the evaluation phase. After the Q&A with the candidate leaves, and then the panel discusses the candidate's interview and determines new scores, new consensus scores, particularly focused of course on the criterion of candidate, as we've now seen this person in action, but implicitly still taking into account the findings of the pre-selection. Your assessment of the project should normally not have shifted dramatically during the interview in principle. At the end of the interview meeting, you will fine-tune the scores for all of the candidates. So once you've seen all of the candidates, you can of course really compare them and fine-tune scores, and on the basis of this score determine the ranking. This is a consensus process, so this has to happen in consensus of the full panel. And then each applicant will be assigned a status. If they fall within the quota, they directly receive the fellowship from the panel. They might become a wild card, one of the best remaining candidates, or they might be rejected in the interview phase if they fall below the quality threshold for funding. Hans, there's a question.
There are some questions on, indeed. First is, how long is the elevator pitch?
The elevator pitch, if I'm not mistaken, in an online context is, I think, 3 minutes. If we do live interviews, the candidates get 5 minutes to pitch their project and their candidacy.
And then a more difficult question, perhaps, how many assignments receive each panel member per panel session?
How many assignments? How many?
Yeah, for reporting and so on. Yeah.
This differs dramatically between panels, and we really can't put a general number on this because the panels differ dramatically in size. Any one panel can receive a lot more applications than another panel. I will say in general, in the big panels, if you're really part of a large panel, this can be up to, at the most, I would think 15 applications to review, but this is really exceptional for some of our larger panels. For example, the GM4 panel is typically a very large panel, or the CUL2 panel. In the smaller panels, this can be down to 3 or 4 applications to review, but it's really hard to put a number on this. It varies throughout the years and throughout the calls as well. So then during the interview meeting, when you're interviewing candidates, you're of course asking questions of these candidates. That's the whole setup, of course. Make sure that you cover all the sub-criteria that are mentioned in the scoring grid, that you really have the scoring grid perhaps in front of you or in mind when you're preparing your questions. You're invited to really thoroughly challenge the candidate. You have about 10 minutes to interview them. You really want to see what they're able to do. You really want to challenge them. You shouldn't be too careful, and you want to really see whether what they've written in their application and what you have decided in your written review, whether that's correct. And you want to substantiate the scores that you have in mind. Feel free to ask non-specialist questions to test the critical mindset of the candidate or their ability to position themselves and their research project in their wider field. The debate with the candidate may be and is perhaps ideally somewhat pleasant or encouraging. It might also be provoking, but please gently provoking. Don't challenge or provoke the candidate too much. Take into account that we really want you to treat the candidates fairly. their stress for these interviews. They're still quite junior researchers in general, certainly for the PhD candidates. These are of course very junior people being invited to come do an interview with a set of international experts like yourself is in and of itself a stressful environment for a lot of people. So please take that into account once you're interviewing them. Also take into account the impact of COVID-19 measures on their lives and their path towards this interview for the past 2 years. That's really something that we ask you to do. That being said, challenge them. You have them in front of you, either online or in Brussels in person. This is really your chance and their chance to shine and to make sure that you're convinced that they can do this. So give them the opportunity to convince you of that by asking them interesting and challenging questions. So you will, as part of this interview meeting, be playing around with scores, adapting the scores. This is something that I'll go over now really quickly. You'll see this, how this works in the interview meeting. Essentially, the score that you gave to the project during the pre-selection phase will be copied, but you will be strongly invited to come up with a new candidate score once you've seen the person in action. You can still adjust the score for the project as well, but it will already be copied in the scoring board that you can see during the meeting. So again, as I mentioned before, remember that for the interview phase of the evaluation cycle, there's another scoring grid as for the pre-selection phase. So take that into account. And then finally, at the end of the meeting, there will be a ranking. And as I indicated before, some candidates will receive the status approved. So this is the number of fellowships you have available in the panel. You will hand these out directly, the quota. But in order to receive this, the candidates should receive a score of 4 or higher on both candidate and project subcriteria. So that's important once you're scoring people to keep in mind. If you give a score of lower than 4, they can't receive a grant from the panel directly. You then determine who are the wildcards, so people still being considered for the 10% remaining fellowships, and then some of the candidates are rejected. Throughout this process, you will be guided by the chairs who really know how to assign these statuses. Keeping in mind, the wildcard status is a quality label. So this means that essentially, if there was unlimited funding available, you would always fund this candidate. And the wildcards will be used later on by us to award the remaining fellowship as a reserve list if somebody drops out, and also by the universities to hand out some bridging fellowships, etc. So the wildcard is a beneficial kind of evaluation as well for the candidates. Finally, after the interview, we will of course also ask you to prepare feedback for the candidates that have been interviewed. Again, these feedback reports are very important. Try to add value. Really, this is your opportunity as a panel to really tell the candidate what you think of their application. You will be writing feedback reports for candidates who do receive the funding, and these will of course be hopefully easy feedback reports to write, but also of course here for candidates who came in for interview and ended up not receiving the funding. This is of course a group of people that's going to be very disappointed probably here. The feedback report is really important for them to try to understand why they ended up not receiving the funding. So really try to give them some insight in this, substantiate the scores. They will be informed of the score, substantiate the scores by looking at the scoring grid. Again, try to use the template of discussing strengths, weaknesses, and then comments for suggestions and suggestions for improvement. And always for these people, refer to the interview. Sometimes we see panel members writing feedback reports in which they don't directly mention the interview, and this can be very discouraging or disappointing for candidates, because then they might think that you didn't take the interview into account, which of course you did. So please mention that clearly in your feedback report as well. You will be asked to submit your feedback report 1 week after the panel meeting. And then finally, one final thing, but this is something where the chairs really take the lead, is the activity reports on the ongoing and recently finished fellowships. These are submitted to the panel by postdocs on an annual basis and by the PhD fellows at the end of their 4 years. So the panels are not involved in the renewal procedures, the 2+2 that we discussed at the beginning of this webinar. But at the end, once the fellowship is finished, we do receive an end report, a final report, and the panel is asked to evaluate this report. This is an entirely written procedure that proceeds via email. All of the activity reports will be made available to you as a panel member via the extranet. The evaluation is prepared, as I indicated earlier, by the chairs of your panel, and they will contact you about this via email and ask you to approve what their suggested evaluation, or to adjust this if you think that this is necessary. So keep an eye out for these emails, which will contain more instructions on how to deal with this aspect of panel membership. And that's about it. I think, Hans, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anne and Dirk and Alexandra. This brings us indeed almost at the end of this webinar. We still have some questions open. I will try to answer some of them. So one of the questions is, how many senior members are there on each panel? Of course, and with senior members is meaning having at least 1 or 2 years experience within the panel. Also there, of course, no exact number, that depends on the panel in question, but in general you can say that we have 12 panel members for each expert panel, and approximately each year we renew 1/3. So that means that in most panels, 8 to 9 panel members have some experiences with past calls, at least 8 or 9. Then how long is the interview meeting? Also there, of course, already answered by Anne. When it came to the number of reports, it depends, of course, on the number of applicants that should receive such an interview process. In general, an interview for each candidate is approximately 20 minutes, taking into account the elevator pitch, the question, the Q&A, and a short time for evaluation by the panel. 20 minutes. You can make the calculations yourself, depending on the number of candidates you need to interview. That also gives you an answer on this question, how long these meetings can last. In general, we can say for the larger panels, it will take up to 2 days in order to give everyone the chance to have their interview. And then last question before we conclude, the reserve list, is it common that candidates withdraw? Not common, but it happens, of course. We are working with pre-doctoral, but most with the postdoctoral fellows. They, of course, have different or multiple opportunities to work. They submit an application at FWO, but probably also at other councils in Europe, or even across Europe or abroad Europe. And at the moment that we take the final decision about funding or non-funding, it is possible that they have also another offer already in their hands, and then it's up to them, of course, to choose whether they go for the fellowship at FWO or they prefer another opportunity. So each year again, we see that some of the candidates withdraw indeed their application, and then we have the reserve list and can pick up some extra candidates from there on. So this concludes this webinar. Thank you very much for your attention. We had a lot of panel members taking part in the discussion and also in the presentation. Thank you for that. You can see on this last slide some links to further reading. On our website, you can find all the guidelines, also this presentation, of course, but also more context about the funding programs, the peer review regulations, and so on. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. You have your account administrator. They already contact you when it comes to the conflict of interest. But if you have any questions, please make use of that email or phone number. And of course, you can also contact your administrative chair, and we will be very happy to help you further with any questions you may have. For now, I would like to thank you for your attention, and on behalf of the whole FWO team, also about Anne, Alexandra and Dirk, who take part in this presentation. We are hoping to see you back for the online meetings later on this year. Thank you very much, and see you soon.